Irving Kristol, author of the autobiography of an idea, Neoconservatism. When was the first time you ever heard that word uttered?
It must have been sometime in the mid-1970s. It was not my term. I did not invent it. I believe it was invented by someone who was criticizing me. And I thought that that was a term of opprobrium. I decided that it was a pretty good description of, in fact, what I was thinking and feeling, so I ran with it.
What does it mean?
What it means is that it refers to a constellation of opinions and views that is not traditionally conservative, but is conservative, and is certainly not liberal. And since I and others who have been called neoconservatives moved from being liberals to being a kind of conservative, then neoconservatism seemed like a pretty good term.
I did some calculations on the 41 different essays you have in the book as to what year they were written. I don't know if you've done this.
No.
41 pieces, and they were written from the 1940s to the 1990s. The most were written in the 70s, 18 of the 41. Why would you guess that the ones you chose for this book were written in the 70s?
I think it's because things, particularly intellectual political things, intellectual and political ideas, were more in flux in the 1970s than either before or after. I mean, that was the decade of transition so far as I was concerned. You know, in 1968, I still voted for Hubert Humphrey. But by 1974, I realized I was going to become a Republican. And by that time, the term neoconservatism had been invented, and I decided I was also a neoconservative.
A couple of other numbers here. Only 2 come from the 80s, and then 12 come from the 90s. Why that big jump?
I'm sure that's just an accident. I mean, there are many essays I've written that are not in this book. More journalistic essays, more timely essays I did not bother to include. And I think I wrote a lot of such essays on economics, for instance. Even though I'm not an economist, I was sufficiently well-versed, I do think, to write on economics. But I did not include most of those, or strictly political analyses of particular elections. So I would think that's why it's so. But frankly, I don't remember all the essays I wrote in the 1970s.
At one point in one of the essays, you admit to working for the CIA.
Yeah.
What's that about?
Oh, back in the 1950s, I was in London co-editing Encounter magazine with Stephen Spender. And I left at the end of 1958. Stephen and I founded the magazine in early 53. I left at the end of 58. And then, I guess it was in the mid-60s or thereabouts, that it was revealed that, in fact, we thought we were being subsidized by an American foundation called the Farfield Foundation. And in fact, that was a front for the CIA, and it was CIA money.
How'd you find out?
It was made public in the press. I don't know how they found out. Somebody leaked, obviously. But I didn't inquire, and I didn't care, really.
What was your reaction at the time?
I was annoyed. I didn't want to work for the CIA. If I had known there was CIA money involved, I would not have taken that particular job.
Why would they want to fund the Encounter magazine?
That's why there were rumors that there was some government money behind it. But the question occurred to me that just occurred to you. Why on earth would they want to fund a magazine that Stephen Spender and I were editing, and whose general political outlook was liberal, not at all conservative? This was, after all, in the Eisenhower years. Mr. Dulles, I believe, was then head of the CIA. It didn't make any sense to me. But it turned out, in fact, there was a liberal group within the CIA that thought it very important to have an intellectual magazine in Europe, and indeed worldwide. We were an English language magazine, and in the end, pretty much a British magazine, but the idea was that we were supposed to be more cosmopolitan than that. And they decided to support the magazine, and once they started supporting it, it was a very successful magazine. They became very proud of it. and didn't let it go until they had to.
The first 39 pages of this book are, you say, are fresh, brand new. No one's ever read them before. What are they about? Why did you...
It's an autobiographical memoir about my own personal intellectual development. And I didn't want to pre-publish it. Some of it is quite personal. Some of it, well, let me put it this way. This is a book in which all the other essays have previously been published. This essay I wanted to be fresh. It's in some ways the most important essay from my point of view that I ever wrote, since it's about me. And I wanted that fresh in the book.
You start off in the very beginning and you say that, get past the preface here to that, you say that you've been a neo-Marxist, a neo-Trotskyist, a neo-socialist, a neo-liberal, and finally a neo-conservative.
That pretty much traces the trajectory of my political beliefs. I've never been comfortable with any of those doctrines because I always saw problems inherent in those doctrines. I even see problems inherent in conservatism today. I think anyone who has studied the history of political thought would be bound to see problems with conservatism today, which is why I still call myself a neoconservative, though in truth, those who would 10 years ago have been called neoconservatives, these days simply call themselves conservatives. The conservative movement has expanded to include us.
What's a neo-Marxist?
There's a Marxist who never accepted the full doctrine of Marxism and who had some severe doubts about some of the important doctrines of Marxism, as I always did from the beginning.
What's a neo, is it Trotskyite or Trotskyist?
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing as a neo-Marxist, except that I did not want ever to be a Stalinist. I was always critical of Stalinist Russia. On the other hand, I found myself, when I was a young socialist, more and more critical of the teachings of Leon Trotsky, and more and more skeptical of them. So I was a neo.
Where did you grow up?
In Brooklyn.
What kind of family did you have?
A very stable, traditional family.
Brothers and sisters?
I had one older sister. She's gone now. And my mother died when I was 16. And we formed a very harmonious household, nevertheless.
What did your dad do?
He was in the garment trade, boys' clothing. And sometimes business was okay, and sometimes, instead of being an employer, he became an employee, depending upon circumstances.
Where'd you go to college?
City College.
What was City College like in those days?
Well, it was a wonderful place. It had a lot of very bright students, very much interested in politics, and very much interested in ideas, along with an interest in politics. And let me put it this way, the faculty I don't think was all that distinguished, but it didn't matter. Most of us students ended up educating each other. And we learned a lot. I learned a lot. It was I got a very good education at City College, not all of it in the classroom.
You talk about the different alcoves where people sat.
Yes.
Which one were you in?
Alcove 1, which was the anti-communist or anti-Stalinist alcove, where socialists of various kinds and some liberals would congregate and argue and exchange ideas. And it was a very nice alcove. It was my second home.
Was that in the cafeteria?
Yes. All the alcoves were in an arc around the cafeteria.
Anybody in that alcove that we would know? Any names that we recognize?
Oh, yes. Some of them, anyhow. Daniel Bell, Melvin Lasky, Philip Selznick, now Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Berkeley, Seymour Martin Lipset, also had been a professor for many years at Berkeley. A lot of people who became fairly well-known academics were in that. Irving Howe was in that alcove, became a well-known literary critic. So, in terms of subsequent careers, the alcove produced quite a lot of people of some distinction.
Who was in alcove 2?
The communists, that is to say, the Stalinists, the people who were apologetic for the Soviet Union, and they did not produce, I think, as many distinguished people as we did, because they didn't have the kind of intellectual stimulation that we had.
Who were some of the people that were in Alcove 2?
Honestly, don't recall. They meant nothing to me.
Did Alcove 1 or Alcove 2 ever meet?
No, Alcove 2 was forbidden to even argue with us. I mean, that was the way the communist organization worked. Young Communist League dominated Alcove 2, and they forbade having conversations or even disputes with Trotskyists or socialists or any sort of non-communist left-wing person.